the Lakota warrior, refused all brides until the giant widow offered him bread. The wind came down off the high plains like a warning, dry and sharp, carrying with it the memory of winter that had never truly left. Lakota rode slow through the open valley, his coat heavy with dust and the weight of too many years spent alone. The Lakota called him a man who could outwait grief, but even patience becomes a prison when a man stops wanting. He had refused every bride the tribe had offered, women kind and strong, chosen with honor. But each one saw in his silence a wall, not a home. To them he was a scar that wouldn't close, a warrior who had lost too much blood to share warmth again. He didn't argue. He simply walked away and built his life on solitude. That afternoon, he followed the long curve of the trail toward Gray Butte. The sun burning low over the ridges, the kind of light that makes even sorrow look sacred. In the distance, he saw a cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, a small sign of life against the empty hills. His horse shifted beneath him, ears twitching, drawn by a scent that reached them on the wind. Fresh bread. Not the coarse rations of the trail, but real bread made by a woman's hands. He hadn't smelled it in years. As he drew closer, he saw her, broad-shouldered, tall, her hair tied in a loose braid streaked with silver. She was standing on the porch, pulling loaves from a wood oven. The smell hit him like a memory he didn't ask for. "You're far from home," she called. "No home," he said, "just ground and sky." "Then take this," she said, holding out a loaf wrapped in cloth. "The world's easier to cross with something warm in your hands." "I don't take from strangers." "Then don't call me one," she said simply, stepping down the porch. "My name's Mara Holt. Eat before the wind eats you." He hesitated, torn between pride and hunger of another kind. "I don't need charity." "Good," she said. "This isn't charity. It's bread." Her tone had no softness in it, just quiet certainty that disarmed him more than pity ever could. He reached for it, his fingers brushing hers. The loaf was still warm, and the contact felt like a fire too small to matter but too honest to ignore. He stepped back, unsure why his chest felt heavier. "Thank you," he muttered, the word foreign in his mouth. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just don't let it get cold." He rode off into the falling dusk, the loaf resting in his saddlebag. And though he told himself it was only food, something in him already knew it wasn't. The first bite came an hour later, eaten in silence beside his campfire, and it tasted like forgiveness he didn't think he deserved. The morning broke pale and silent, the kind of dawn that made the mountains look carved from bone. Lakota woke beside the fading fire, the last crumbs of the widow's bread wrapped in cloth by his saddle. He'd meant to throw them away, but his hand had refused. Instead, he packed them carefully, as if warmth could be stored for later. His horse snorted and pawed at the frost, restless to move, yet Lakota's thoughts lingered on the woman, the giant widow with steady hands and eyes that looked through a man without fear. He told himself it meant nothing. But meaning has its own will, and sometimes it follows a man like his shadow. He rode toward the river where the herds grazed, but the valley felt different now, less empty, less willing to echo his loneliness. He dismounted by a fallen cottonwood and knelt to drink. And in the reflection, he saw not the warrior others feared, but a man half-starved for something he couldn't name. The wind shifted, carrying smoke and the faint sound of hammering. He looked up and saw the widow's cabin again, far across the flat, a thin plume rising from her chimney. She was mending her fence, sleeves rolled, moving like someone who never waited for rescue. He watched for a long while, telling himself he was guarding the trail. Then he caught sight of her hand, red and blistered from the work, and before he knew it, he was in the saddle again. When he reached the fence, she turned, surprised but not startled. "You forgot something?" she asked. "To say your bread was good," he said. "That's not a favor I need paid." "Maybe I do," he said. He took the hammer from her hand, his own calloused palm dwarfing it. "You swing like someone fighting ghosts." "I've had practice," she said. "And you?" "I fight silence." "Who wins?" "Not me." The corner of her mouth lifted and she let him help. They worked without talk, the sound of wood and metal filling the empty space where two solitudes had met. When the last board was set, she dusted her hands and said, You can come back if you mean to work, not wander. He nodded once, mounting up. I'll bring my own hammer next time. Then maybe I'll bake more bread, she said, not smiling, but not cold either. As he rode away, the trail behind him felt shorter than before, and the world smelled faintly of smoke and hope, two things he'd long thought extinct. By the time the snow thinned and the valley turned to gold and mud, Dakota had found more reasons to ride toward the widow's cabin than toward his own camp. He told himself it was the trail, or the need for lumber, or the weather shifting hard enough to test a man's sense of duty, but none of those excuses carried weight. The truth rode quieter. He came because the silence there felt different. It didn't echo. It listened. The morning he returned, she was trying to lift a beam that had cracked under thaw. The hammer slipped in her hand, striking the wood and grazing her palm. He saw the blood before she did, and was off his horse before his mind caught up. You'll lose a finger that way, he said, taking the beam before she could protest. You back again? She asked, breath short. Just passing through. You passed through yesterday. Then maybe the trail circles. Or maybe you're lost. Her tone wasn't unkind. It was steady, like someone stating the weather. He held the beam in place while she wedged the brace beneath. When it was done, she stepped back, hair loose, cheeks flushed with cold. You don't talk much, she said. Words don't fix beams. No, but they stop ghosts from eating you alive. I got used to the taste. That's no kind of living. He looked at her then. Really looked. At the lines that hardship had carved, deep but not cruel, at hands that knew both mercy and firewood, at eyes that had stopped asking permission to be strong. You always bake for strangers? He asked. Only the ones who look hungrier than they admit. She poured him coffee, black and bitter, and sat opposite. The cup felt strange in his hands, warmth that didn't demand anything back. My people buried bread with the dead, he said finally, so the journey wouldn't be empty. Maybe that's why you came back. For the journey? For the living. The air between them trembled like the pause before thunder. He reached into his saddlebag and set a carved cedar feather on the table, small, simple, smooth from long hours of his thumb tracing it. For your fence, he said. To keep spirits out? To remind them some places are worth guarding. She turned it over in her palm, eyes softening. You believe in spirits? Only the ones that stay when they don't have to. Then stay, she said, almost a whisper. He wanted to, but wanting was the first step back to pain, and pain was what he had sworn to leave buried. He stood, adjusting his coat. I'll mend the north gate tomorrow. You'll need a hammer. I've got one, she smiled faintly. Then I'll bake 2 loaves. He paused at the door, sunlight spilling around him, the world bright and cold and too wide. You bake like someone fighting winter, he said. You mend like someone running from it. Their eyes met just long enough for truth to flicker between them, small, fragile, but alive. He left before it could grow roots, yet even as his horse carried him down the trail, the smell of her bread followed, warm and unyielding, and he realized that some fences weren't built to keep things out, but to see if something would find its way back. The next morning came with a hard wind off the ridge and clouds low enough to touch the hills. Dakota rode early, his coat lined with frost and the cedar feather tucked safely in his pocket. He told himself it was only to fix the north gate, nothing more. But the truth pressed against his ribs the way hunger does when a man hasn't eaten in years. He wanted to see her again. The cabin smoke rose thin through the gray light, steady as a heartbeat, and when he reached the fence, Mara was already outside, sleeves rolled, nails clenched between her teeth as she measured a plank. She didn't startle when he appeared. She only nodded once, as if she'd known he'd come. You brought your hammer? She asked. And 2 good hands, he said. Then maybe we'll finish before the storm finds us. They worked without speech, rhythm falling easy. Like 2 songs that had always shared the same tune. The wind rattled the boards, the smell of pine tar and sweat mixing with the faint sweetness that lingered on her skin from baking. After a while, she said, You still think ghosts belong outside fences? He paused mid-swing. Some do. And some? Some keep watch. She leaned against the post, studying him. And which one are you? Depends who's asking. A woman with too much land and not enough peace. He looked up then, meeting her eyes full on. Then I'll be the kind that stays till your fence stops falling. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick, full, waiting. A crow passed overhead, black wings cutting through the gray, and she said quietly, "My husband built this place, thought it would keep the world small enough to manage. Turns out grief fits anywhere." He was lucky, Dakota said, to be remembered, to have someone who still builds in his shadow. And you? Luck and I quit speaking long ago, she smiled faintly. Maybe it's time you make peace. With what? Whatever made you leave your people. He didn't answer, not because he wouldn't, but because she'd asked it softly enough to hurt. He drove the final nail deep, the sound sharp in the quiet. When the gate held, she exhaled slow and said, "That's the first thing that stood straight in months." Then we did something right. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, eyes shining from wind or tears. He couldn't tell which. "You'll eat before you go." "I didn't plan on staying." "Plans change," she said, already turning toward the cabin. He hesitated, then followed. Boots sinking into the thawing earth. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, the scent of bread curling through the air again, stronger now, heavier. She set a plate on the table and looked at him, not smiling, not shy, just certain. "You can fix fences all you want," she said, "but some things don't need mending, they just need warmth." He sat, the chair creaking under his weight, and for the first time in years, Dakota ate without counting what he'd lost. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge, but in that small cabin, the world was still. By dusk, the storm had come down hard, drumming against the cabin roof like hooves in the dark. Dakota had meant to ride before it broke, but the clouds moved quicker than pride, and now he sat by the hearth while Mara fed the flames with split logs, her movements sure, her face lit gold and red. The sound of wind outside was a thing alive, clawing at the door, but inside there was only the steady breath of fire and two people pretending not to listen for each other's silence. "You've faced worse storms," she said, her voice low. "I've slept through some," he answered, "but not under a roof like this." "You say that like it's a burden. For a man who's buried roofs before, it is." She turned, brow furrowing. "You think loss means you stop needing warmth? It means you learn not to expect it. Then unlearn it," she said simply. He looked into the flames, remembering another fire, one lit after a raid, his brother's blood drying in the dirt, his wife's hair tangled in his hands. He hadn't spoken her name since. The silence in him had grown roots, deep and cold. But here, the light pressed against him, insistent. Mara sat down across from him, her hands folded, her eyes the same color as the bread she'd baked. "I know that look," she said. "You don't." "I do. I've worn it." "What buried you?" "A fever, a child that never took a breath, a man who didn't know how to stay." The wind hit the window hard enough to rattle it, but she didn't flinch. "So I built fences, baked bread, and stopped waiting." "You waited tonight." "No," she said softly. "I just left the fire burning." The space between them closed like a breath drawn in. He reached for his coat, pretending he meant to leave, but his hands wouldn't move. Instead, he said, "I was a husband once, and a brother, and both graves still talk." "Then let them," she whispered. "Maybe they're tired of being the only ones who do." He met her eyes, something sharp breaking loose in his chest, and for the first time in years, the air didn't feel heavy with ghosts. It felt alive. The thunder rolled, long and distant, and Mara added another log, her sleeve brushing his. "You'll ride when it clears," she said. "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe I'll stay till the gate falls again." She smiled faintly. "Then I'll make extra bread." The fire cracked, the storm howled, and for the first time since the war, Dakota didn't think about the road beyond dawn. He only thought about the smell of bread, the shape of her hands, and the warmth that felt like something he could still deserve. Morning came soft and gray, the storm spent, the ground heavy with melted snow and silence. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney, thin and steady, the kind that meant someone was still alive inside. Dakota woke on the chair he hadn't meant to sleep in. The fire burned low, the scent of ash and bread mingling like memory. Mara was already outside, boots deep in mud gathering fallen branches. He stepped out quietly, breath clouding in the chill, and for a moment just watched her. How her body moved with the patience of someone who'd stopped expecting help, but hadn't stopped giving it. When she turned, she didn't startle. You stayed. The storm made me. Storm's gone. Not sure it is, she smiled faintly. Then maybe let it finish raining. He helped her gather the last of the wood, neither speaking for a long time. Every time their hands brushed, the air between them changed, heavier but not uncomfortable, like a sky before spring. Your tribe, she said finally, they'll think you lost. They thought that long before you did. And you? A man who walks alone doesn't have to be found. Maybe, she said, but he can still be seen. Her words sat in him like a seed, small but alive. They carried the bundles back to the porch, and she wiped her hands on her apron before reaching into her pocket. You left this, she said, pulling out the carved cedar feather he'd given her for the fence. He frowned. You keep it. No, you carve it for a reason. You said it keeps spirits near. I did. Then keep it, she said, pressing it into his hand, because I think one's trying to find its way home. He looked down at it, thumb tracing the grain, then looked back up, but she'd already turned toward the door. Mara, he said. She stopped. That's your name. And you have one too. Dakota. Means what? Friend to all. She smiled, the kind that a man doesn't forget. Then maybe it's time to start meaning it again. The wind shifted, lifting her hair, carrying the faint warmth of the hearth. He didn't move closer, not yet. But as she went inside, he whispered her name once, softly enough that only the feather heard it. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like an echo. It felt like a beginning. A week passed before Dakota rode beyond the ridge again, and when he did, the valley seemed sharper, the wind less cruel. The snow was gone, replaced by green pushing through the thaw, and yet something inside him refused to thaw fully. He told himself the visits would stop, that the widow's cabin was a kindness best left alone, but his horse had learned the way by heart, and some mornings he didn't argue. In town, the talk had started, whispers that the Lakota warrior had found shelter in a white woman's home. Some said he'd gone soft, others said she'd gone mad. Dakota heard it all, jaw tight, hands steady. He'd lived through worse words. Still, when one rancher laughed loud enough for him to hear, maybe the widow bakes for whoever wanders close, something inside him snapped quiet. He didn't fight, just looked at the man until laughter dried to silence. You ever been hungry? Dakota asked. The man tried to grin, failed. Ain't talking about food. Neither am I. He left it there. By the time he rode back through the valley, the sun was falling low, and his chest felt heavy with all the things mercy demands of pride. The widow was at her garden, planting early seeds against the chill. When she saw him, her brow furrowed. You're bleeding. He glanced down, a scrape along his knuckle, nothing more. Just skin. Then sit, she said, fetching a bowl of water. You're a hard man to find gentle with yourself. Gentle doesn't last. It does if you feed it. She cleaned the cut without asking, her hands steady, her touch simple. They talk in town, she said finally. Let them, he replied. I stopped listening to men who speak with their mouths instead of their hands. It bothers you. It bothers me that they think kindness is weakness. Then show them it isn't. He looked up, meeting her eyes. And what will they say about you? That I shared bread, she said. That's enough for me. He wanted to tell her it wasn't enough for him, that he'd carried the taste of that first loaf through every mile since, that her voice had started to sound like home when the wind got quiet. Instead, he said, Fence still holding? Mostly. Then I'll check it tomorrow. You'll eat first. If there's bread. Always. The light faded, and as he rode off, he realized her words didn't sound like promise. They sounded like faith. And for a man who'd buried both, that was the first danger he was willing to face again. The next morning dawned clean and gold, the kind of light that made the hills look washed of old sins. Dakota rode in early, before the town had woken, before the wagons started to creak, carrying a sack of flour across his saddle. The widow was kneeling by the fire pit, sleeves rolled, hair loose, shaping dough like she was forming the world back into order. She looked up when she heard his boots. You came early. You said there'd be bread. There always is. He set down the sack. Then here's the next one. She smiled faintly. You don't owe me anything. Then let's call it even. You gave me fire. I give you more to feed it. She paused, watching him, her hands dusted white. You ever stay anywhere long enough to see a harvest? Once, he said, before the war. Before everything turned to smoke. Then maybe stay till this one. And if the tribe comes for me, then I'll tell them you're still healing. And if they don't believe you, then I'll bake for them too. He laughed once, quiet and short, like something rusted trying to move again. You talk like mercy's never cost you. It has, she said, but I paid it anyway. He nodded, and for a while neither spoke. The only sound was the fire, soft and steady, the same one that had burned through nights of cold and silence. He helped her move the woodpile closer, the old rhythm of work between them smooth and wordless. When the bread rose, the scent filled the cabin, sweet, grounded, holy in its simplicity. She tore a piece, handed it to him without ceremony. Eat, she said. You'll need strength. For what? For deciding whether you're staying. He looked at her hand, at the small scar along her thumb, at the woman who had made space for him without asking why. I've been strong too long, he said. Maybe it's time to be steady. Then stay steady here. The wind outside shifted, warm for the first time in weeks. He broke the bread in half and handed it back to her. Then we share it. She met his eyes, no smile, just truth. That's how it lasts. The fire flickered, catching both their faces in its glow. It wasn't promise, not yet, but it was beginning to sound like one. Spring crept down the valley slow, the kind of patient change that only people who've known loss can trust. The snows withdrew from the ridge, leaving behind damp earth and wild violets, and the cabin took on the smell of wood smoke and bread that meant a life had found roots. Dakota split logs in the yard while Mara hung linens between two fence posts, the fabric snapping in the wind like small white flags of surrender. You don't rest much, she said without looking up. Rest feels too much like waiting. And what are you waiting for? A reason to stay, she smiled faintly. Maybe it's already here. He didn't answer right away. His axe hit the wood hard, the clean split echoing down the ridge. The world doesn't give men like me reasons, he said. You just keep walking until one finds you. Maybe this time it has. He looked up, and her eyes caught the sunlight just right, that soft brown that had no fear left in it. She went back to her work, humming an old hymn, her voice thin but certain. It was the first time he'd heard her sing. Something in him broke loose, not the bad kind, but the kind that lets air back in after too long underwater. What's it called? He asked. Doesn't matter, she said. I hum what I can't say out loud. Then hum it again. She did, and the sound filled the space between them like smoke curling around light. By the time she finished, the air was still. You'll bring trouble, you know, he said finally. So will you, she replied. Maybe we'll even it out. He smiled, slow and genuine, a look that felt borrowed from a younger version of himself. Inside, the fire burned low, the scent of ash soft as a lullaby. He reached into his coat and pulled out the carved feather she'd made him keep, hanging it over the doorway this time instead of his belt. What's that for? She asked. To remind the wind whose names it carries. And what name does it carry tonight? Yours, he said simply. The wind shifted again, threading through the feather, and for the first time since the war, Dakota realized silence could speak, and mercy could stay. The first harvest came early that year, golden wheat rippling across the flats like light learning to move again. Mara stood on the porch, apron dusted with flour, watching Dakota ride back from the far field where the tribe's riders waited at the ridge. He dismounted slow, shoulders squared, face calm in that quiet way only men who've made peace with their ghosts can manage. They wanted to see if I was still alive, he said. And are you? More than before. She nodded, smiling faintly. Then come in. The bread's done. He followed her inside, the smell of fresh loaves rising with the warmth. On the table lay a single small braid of dough baked in a ring. For them? He asked. For you, she said. You broke enough battles. You should break bread instead. He sat, the chair creaking under his weight. And she poured water into the tin cups, the light catching on the steam. They'll talk, he murmured. They already do, she answered. Let them say Mercy found a home. He tore the bread, handed half to her. Then it's our home. For a long while they ate in silence, the kind that feels like belonging instead of absence. Outside, wind brushed through the open window, carrying the sound of distant drums from the ridge. Slow, steady, not mourning anymore. Mara looked toward it, her eyes wet but not from sadness. "They're blessing you," she said. "No," he corrected gently. "Us." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting on the scars along his arm. "You ever think you'd come to this?" "Not in this lifetime," he said, smiling. She laughed softly. "Then maybe this is another one." The firelight flickered across their faces, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a stranger to it. Later, when the night deepened and the wind turned cool, he stepped outside, looked at the stars scattered over the ridge, and whispered in Lakota, "Wafala." "Thanks." Behind him, Mara's voice carried from the doorway. "You talking to the sky?" "To whoever's listening." "Then tell them supper's getting cold." He turned, smiling, and walked back inside as the feather above the door swayed once in the warm draft. If this story reminded you that even the hardest hearts can learn to stay, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Subscribe to Redemption West, where mercy is never weakness and love always comes home.